So the monster the Ed Gein story starts right in on Ed Gein being a total creep in Plainfield, Wisconsin. He's stalking this woman, Adeline, who he thinks he loves. He's literally hiding out while she and her friend Madison are checking themselves out in their underwear. Ed gets all worked up, starts rocking, and the floorboards creak. They almost catch him, but the weirdo manages to bolt out of Adeline's house before anyone sees him. He gets back home, and what does he do? He puts on his mother's knickers and starts doing explicit stuff. But mid-act, his strict and terrifying mother, Augusta Gein, barges in and catches him red-handed. She drags him, completely naked, into the living room and unleashes her usual fire and brimstone lecture about sin, lust, and women being the root of evil. When Ed tries to defend his feelings for Adeline, Augusta shuts it down immediately. She tells him to stay away from her, and from any woman, because they're all wicked. But a few moments later, Ed's right back out, meeting Adeline at a local diner. They're sipping milkshakes and having a casual chat about Nazis and concentration camps. They talk about Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, who even has a pulp magazine written about her. Ed's already obsessed with photos of corpses, but the show paints Koch as his artistic inspiration. Seriously messed up. Next, Ed is chopping wood in the barn when his brother Henry shows up and announces he's marrying a twice-divorced woman named Ginny. Ed is like, "You can't do that? Mom will flip." Henry is done with their mother's nonsense and tells Ed he needs to escape the cage she's put them in, calling her sick in the head. Ed gets pissed and refuses to discuss it. Henry gives him one last piece of advice about leaving their mother behind and walks away. That's when Ed strikes his brother with a piece of chopped wood, and Henry dies right there. As he's moving the wood, Ed completely deludes himself. He imagines Henry getting up, shrugging off the injury, taking back all the bad stuff he said about their mother, and promising to apologize to her. This false conversation actually cheers Ed up. At dinner, Ed asks Augusta if Henry followed through on that imaginary promise, still convinced his brother's alive somewhere, only for her to say she hasn't seen him and doesn't care to. She calls Henry a disgrace, and then goes on a vicious rant about her life, how her husband defiled her, how she wanted daughters but got two useless sons, and how only a mother could ever love someone as pathetic as Ed. It's cruel, but Ed doesn't even realize how much she's degrading him. He hears only the word love, and feels happy about it. The nightmare officially kicks off when Ed realizes Henry is still dead. He drags the body into the bushes and sets woods on fire. His story is that Henry collapsed while they were burning woods together, so asphyxiation killed him. The real Henry Gein was officially said to have died from asphyxiation while burning vegetation, but Ryan Murphy's version has Ed kill his brother deliberately and cover it up. After the death, Ed tries to comfort Augusta, saying he knows she always loved Henry more, but now that Henry's gone, he'll be the perfect son she wants. Then he realizes she's not responding. She's suffered a stroke. He rushes her to the doctor, who tells him she needs constant care. While tending to her, Ed's mind starts to slip further. He hallucinates scenes of Ilse Koch bathing a corpse, hosting grotesque parties where Jewish prisoners serve drinks, and riding a donkey through her home. It's his dark fantasy world merging with his reality, an early glimpse into how detached from sanity he's becoming. Eventually, Augusta insists on going to collect rent money from their neighbors, the Smiths. Ed begs her to rest, but she refuses, calling him weak and spineless. They go together, but the confrontation gets her too worked up, and she collapses from another stroke, this time fatal. After burying his mother, Ed walks home in silence, sits in her favorite rocking chair, and for a moment, imagines hearing her voice screaming at him to get up. When he sits back down, the voice disappears. It's like she's both gone and still haunting him. Left completely alone, Ed slides back into his disturbing habits and wears her underwear again. He hears her voice, telling him to stop, but then she says if he wants her back so badly, he should resurrect her. Ed takes this literally. He rushes to Plainfield Cemetery and starts digging up her body. When he can't get to his mother's corpse, he just digs up the woman in the grave next to her. He brings the body home, sits her on Augusta's rocking chair, and disrobes her, like a grotesque replacement. Adeline has always been the only person Ed's ever connected with, if you can call it that. They bond over their mutual weirdness, their fascination with death, and their comfort talking about things most people would run from. But while Adeline enjoys that kind of dark talk in theory, Ed's the type to take it way too literally. So when he casually mentions that he made a bowl out of a human skull, just like Ilse Koch, the Nazi artist who used human skin for crafts, Adeline laughs it off, assuming he's joking. To prove himself, and because he intends to marry her, Ed takes her home against his dead mother's disapproval. Upon arriving, Adeline is immediately creeped out. Ed waves and speaks to his supposedly dead mother, and the entire house is dark and messed up. For someone who claims to love death, she's clearly not built for this level of creepy. And Ed doesn't help matters when he proudly shows her a chair made out of human skin and nipples. The final straw comes when Ed introduces her to his mother, who, of course, is actually someone else's dead body propped in a chair. Adeline doesn't see the corpse clearly, just the silhouette. But that's enough. She bolts right out of there without even a goodbye, let alone the kiss Ed was hoping for. To him, this was a perfect date. To everyone else, yeah, dude's kind of autistic in the social awareness department. Days later, Ed buries himself in Ilse comics. He tries to release his rage by shooting squirrels, but it isn't enough. So he goes to a local bar run by a woman named Mary Hogan, a German bartender built like his mother. Mary's offer to introduce him to women for his sexual pleasure becomes her death sentence. Ed excuses himself to the bathroom, where his mind transports him to a Nazi gathering with Ilse Koch, which fuels his decision. He comes out, aims his gun at Mary, tells her she isn't worthy of being compared to his mother, calls her a Jezebel for suggesting a hookup, and puts a bullet in her head. He then takes her body and some cash to make it look like a robbery, but he didn't factor in that Mary's husband saw his car pull up at the bar before he left, suggesting his arrest is now inevitable. Then the show jumps 14 years after Augusta Gein's death. We're suddenly in a smoky Hollywood room with filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock, his wife Alma, and writer Robert Bloch, who's just finished a new novel called Psycho, based on Ed Gein's crimes. Hitchcock is obsessed with Ed's psychology and wants to turn the story into a film. Bloch explains that Ed's issues were likely triggered after seeing photos of dead bodies in Nazi Germany. While normal people saw horror, Ed saw a thing people just do. He also points out that Ed was born in 1906 and grew up in an environment steeped in religious fear, violence, and death. Mix that with sexual repression, and you basically get the monster they're now writing about. Hitchcock decides to cast Anthony Perkins as his lead because he believes Ed had forbidden, internalized sexual issues that led him to become a monster. Perkins, a gay man who privately likes to cross-dress but hides it, even puking after intimacy because he hates how it feels, is considered perfect for the role because he understands that painful duality. Hitchcock takes Perkins to the Psycho set, which is an exact replica of Ed Gein's farmhouse, complete with grotesque props, even preserved female body parts. Perkins immediately throws up and tells Hitchcock that no censor in the world will ever allow this film to be released. But Hitchcock doesn't care. He's not trying to entertain. He wants to provoke and disturb the audience, feeling a strange satisfaction when people are nauseated and criticized his sadistic creation. He even calls his wife Mother, suggesting he too may not be entirely okay. We finally get a closer look at Ed's father, George Gein, a full-blown drunk who spends his days passed out in filth. When Augusta finds him sprawled on the floor, she's furious at what she sees as weakness. The fight that follows is ugly, and when George hits her, Augusta beats him right out of the house. In her words, that's the last they'll ever see of him. And she's right. George eventually dies of heart failure, likely from the bottle that's been killing him all along. To celebrate her husband's exit, Augusta puts on a record, and she and Ed dance around the house, a twisted version of happiness that clearly imprints itself deep into his mind. Cut to years later, and Ed's still dancing. Only this time, he's wearing Mary's face and his mother's dress. The party doesn't last, though. The sheriff soon shows up asking questions about Mary. Ed plays innocent, claiming he hasn't seen her since last week and that, of course, he spent that night with his mother. Then, just to steer suspicion away, he hints that Mary wasn't exactly a saint in her Chicago days. The cop leaves, but Ed's not off the hook for long. Ed's at his favorite diner when Adeline shows up very much alive, which shocks Ed because he'd already hallucinated killing her. He apologizes on his mother's behalf for being rude during Adeline's last visit, as he assumes that was why she left. Their conversation shifts to Christine Jorgensen, the first person in the US to have sex reassignment surgery, which excites Ed. He rushes out, saying he will surprise her on Friday. That surprise turns out to be a marriage proposal, complete with a ring he dug up from a corpse. Literally. He puts it on her finger in the cemetery, and when she says yes, they start making out, until he spots his mother's grave and freaks out. He retorts all of Augusta's hateful sayings: don't procreate, don't fornicate, blah blah blah. Adeline assumes this fear comes from his abusive childhood and gets him a job as a babysitter at the Heller household in the hopes that being around kids will cure him. This is a terrible idea. On his first night with Frank Jr. and Enid, Ed takes the kids to his house and performs a magic show with his skull bowls, bones, severed fingers, and flayed skin, completely terrifying the children. Mr. Heller heavily reprimands Ed and tells him to never come near his kids again. When Ed learns that Evelyn, the original babysitter, has recovered from polio and taken her job back, he becomes obsessed. He stalks her, and one night, he attacks. After knocking Evelyn out, Ed pays Adeline a visit, saying he's finally ready to get married. Against her mother's warnings, Adeline moves in. She starts tidying up, playing the dutiful homemaker, while Ed checks on his sleeping mother. But when she notices a light in Augusta's room and decides to peek in, she finds Ed wearing Mary's face again, dressed as Augusta, lunging straight at her. In the final stretch, we see Anthony Perkins, who played Norman Bates, the fictional version of Ed Gein in the film, trying to move on from Psycho, while also battling his own repression. He breaks up with his boyfriend, convinces himself he's cured of homosexuality, and gets trapped in his success. producers only want him for strange roles. Hitchcock suffers the same issue, as producers demand more perverse and psychosexual content. After watching a sequence from the blood pit of horror, Hitchcock realizes that he's opened a Pandora's box of sadistic cinema, where real violence against women becomes entertainment. The film cuts back to its source, Ed Gein. He drags Evelyn's body into his tool shed, blames her for ruining his dream life with Adeline, and uses his mother's corpse to help kill her, a grotesque parody of family bonding. The camera seamlessly blends that with the iconic hammer scene from the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, showing how Ed's madness became the blueprint for a whole generation of horror. Because in the end, what began as one man's sickness became everyone's spectacle. Adeline's scream isn't because Ed lunged at her, that was just in his head. What she really sees is the decomposing body. While Adeline dashes out in horror, Ed's out back embalming Evelyn Hartley, the babysitter he killed, lovingly painting over her skin like he's preparing her for Sunday service. The moment he hears Adeline scream, he rushes over, trying to explain himself, as if any of this could ever make sense. When Adeline runs home, Ed follows her, still somehow thinking he can fix things. But instead of locking him out or calling the police, Adeline does something even stranger. She seduces him. She lays her underwear out in plain sight, confronts him about stealing them, and confesses that she actually found it passionate. It's like she's meeting his madness halfway. She admits she's fascinated by the grotesque too. Ouija's crime scene photos, corpses, decay, none of it bothers her. She even asks Ed what it felt like to touch a dead body for the first time. For Ed, this is the closest thing to being understood, and that sense of connection pushes him right back into his workshop, where he returns to Evelyn's body and, well, finishes expressing his joy. Then the story drifts to Bernice Worden, a lonely widow trying to patch the emotional hole left by a dead husband and a disastrous affair. After her lover's wife took her own life, the town turned on Bernice, branding her a homewrecker. Now she lives on pills and isolation, running her small grocery store and aching for affection. So she is instantly hooked on Ed when he checks on her health during his visits to buy exorbitant amounts of lime to speed up decomposition. Ed asks her to lunch, and when he repeatedly stares down her blouse, Bernice feels a sense of excitement. When Ed asks to wear her underwear, Bernice is not repulsed, believing he's just being naughty. They make love passionately, which I assume is Ed's first time, and for a moment, both lonely souls convince themselves this could be love, with Bernice even encouraging Ed to move in. But that illusion doesn't last long. When he arrives home to say his goodbyes to his mother, his schizophrenia strikes again. At first, Augusta seems calm, even approving. But then the real voice kicks in, cruel, venomous, preaching that Bernice is filth, that she spread disease, broke a Christian home, tempted men, defiled herself. None of it's real, of course. It's all Ed's mind, looping back to the poison she left in him. The next time he visits Bernice, he calls her unclean, says his mother warned him she carries venereal disease. Bernice courageously breaks up with him and asks him to leave. However, Ed has decided to punish her. He shoots her in the head and drags her corpse back to his house. In a sign of his growing psychosis, he sees her blood as bright green, not red, a marker of his inability to distinguish imagination from reality. Ed soon brings Adeline back to his house to reveal his real acts. He has strung up Bernice's body in the shed and gutted her like an animal. And somehow, Adeline stays. She watches. She even takes photos. Yeah, they are both sick in the head. From there, the story jumps to Texas, where a young boy named Tobe Hooper listens, wide-eyed, as his uncle tells him about the butcher of Plainfield. The story lodges in his mind like a splinter, and he's fascinated by the idea of Ed skinning his victims to make masks. Years later, standing in line at a store, Tobe imagines revving up a chainsaw and cutting through the queue. The idea, both horrifying and fascinating, becomes a script. He decides that Hitchcock's Psycho was too tame, lacking gore, and that his version of Ed Gein's story will show everything Hitchcock didn't dare to. The result? The Texas Chain Saw Massacre, a movie so violent it turned audiences into voyeurs, horrified but unable to look away. As Hooper's Leatherface dances in the Texas sun wearing someone else's face, we're reminded where it all began, with Ed Gein wearing the skin of his victims not just to hide, but to become someone else. A woman, maybe, something his society would absolutely condemn. Just how many movies did this man inspire? We shift to Adeline's story. She's got big dreams, and all that learn to be a wife tradition isn't for her. She's having casual flings, gaining a reputation as a player, a modern-day feminist who refuses to conform to the town's dusty rules. She's become completely obsessed with moving to New York City to work under Mr. Ouija, the macabre crime photographer. She writes him countless letters, and eventually, he agrees to meet her. Now Adeline walks around with this new, cutting confidence, dismissing anyone she deems too small-minded to survive a city like New York. After using and discarding a boy named Randy, she starts to see Ed as too clingy. While they share a special, twisted bond, Adeline wants to move on and explore. When Ed tries to get intimate, she bluntly tells him she's leaving soon, and he should forget about marriage. Working a farm, cooking for a husband, that's not her story. Ed is crushed, heavy with rejection and pent-up desire. And that's when Adeline, in a moment that's equal parts cruel and deranged, gives him chilling advice. She tells him to get intimate with a girl who can't say no, meaning a corpse. She even suggests he dig up a fresh one. Earlier, her mother had forced her to attend Eleanor Adams' sewing lessons, which she absolutely hated. She stormed out, cursed the woman, and promised she'd laugh at her funeral. The dark twist? She actually does, and Eleanor Adams becomes Ed's first victim. Adeline eventually heads to New York and meets Mr. Ouija, only to realize he never took her seriously. He only agreed to meet because she wouldn't stop writing. When he sees her photos, he laughs them off, assuming they're just pictures of dead animals, not realizing how real her work truly is. To make things worse, she can't even afford a warm room. She's stuck in a freezing cold room, where her tears literally freeze on her face. Desperate and humiliated, she snaps, assaults the hotel owner, steals her money and runs. With nowhere left to go, Adeline slinks back to Plainfield, fuming with rage and shame. Her mother greets her return with pure venom. She admits she tried to kill Adeline while pregnant, throwing herself around just to induce a miscarriage. She calls her useless, unlovable, and incapable of ever keeping a man. Adeline's ego shatters. With nothing left, she goes back to Ed, the only man twisted enough to still want her. But Ed's not the same anymore. He's lost in his new obsession, the corpse of Eleanor Adams. Sometimes he imagines she's alive. Other times, he pretends she's Ilse Koch. It's stomach-turning. When Adeline shows up, she starts kissing him, looking for comfort, maybe even redemption. Ed kisses her back at first, but then stops. What he says next freezes the air. "You're warm." I don't like that. That's how far gone he is. He prefers the cold of the dead. Moments later, Adeline is in the bathtub, and Ed starts pouring in buckets of ice. His final, perverse attempt to make her just like the corpse. Bernice's son Frank wanted a homely Thanksgiving this year. Even though his mom had given up homely duties after her husband's death and her lover's departure, she decides to do it this time to make her son happy. As they're putting together their Thanksgiving list, we jump to a few hours after Bernice's murder. Frank and the sheriff walk into her store, looking for her, but all they find is blood. And a box of lingerie Bernice had bought for Ed, with his name still written on it. That's enough evidence to send chills through the room. Within minutes, the sheriff, Frank, and the entire department storm the Gein property, flipping everything upside down. What they find inside isn't human. Not really. Body parts scattered around like props from a nightmare. The walls, the furniture, not real. Everything screams horror. Frank, desperate, assumes maybe his mother's still alive. Maybe she's out in the barn. He's half right. She is in the barn. But what's hanging there barely qualifies as human. He's taken out everything in her, and all that's left is just skin on bone. And right then, Ed walks back home like it's just another day. The sheriff arrests him on the spot. Frank lunges, punching him over and over, but Ed just keeps talking nonsense, lying through his teeth. He denies everything, says he didn't kill anyone, just dug up bodies sometimes. The coroner's scene is heartbreaking, piecing together Bernice's body from the horror show inside Ed's house, just so Frank can bury her. As Ed's crimes come to light, Adeline tries to distance herself from his actions, using the brief spotlight to try and get a job. But she quickly learns that without her association with the horrific crimes, she is nothing more than an arrogant country girl. After Bernice's funeral, Adeline attempts to pose as a member of the press to ask Frank provocative questions, but the sheriff shoos her away, calling her a pest. That is her pathetic legacy. Now, historically, Adeline did admit to knowing Ed, even claimed they had a long relationship, but later said she only said that for publicity. Whether that's true or not, the show doesn't care. When the sheriff interrogates Ed, he just keeps denying. Says he dug up corpses, sure, but insists he never killed anyone. The sheriff presses him about Bernice's condition, about what he did to her body, but Ed keeps going in circles. Finally, the sheriff throws him a curveball, asks if he's been feeding human meat to neighbors, since he's always hunting, but never brings back any animal. Ed just shrugs and says he doesn't remember. That becomes his favorite trick. It's his shield. Eventually, he even suggests they run a lie detector test. And back then, people actually trusted polygraphs. So when Ed passes on a bunch of his denials, the police can't legally hold him accountable for most of the body parts found in his home. The only murders he admits to are Mary Hogan's and Bernice Worden's. Those two, he owns, and their families get the only closure this story offers. After the investigation, the sheriff invites Frank over for Thanksgiving dinner. A simple gesture, trying to fill the silence left by his mother's absence. But when he slices into the turkey with that electric knife, the sight makes him think about how Ed must have butchered Bernice. A few months after Ed Gein's arrest, Frank Worden still can't wrap his head around what happened to his mom. It's not just grief, it's rage, disgust, and helplessness all boiling under his skin. The man who tore his world apart isn't even rotting in a cell. He's sitting comfortably in a psychiatric hospital because the court decided he wasn't sane enough for prison. So Frank comes up with his own way of getting justice. Not through violence, but exposure. If he can't make Ed suffer, he'll make the world see exactly who he was. He sets up an estate auction at Ed's house, inviting locals, out-of-towners, and even reporters to come and gawk at the home of the butcher of Plainfield. Every item is tagged with a price, from simple dishes to the horrifying tools Ed used for his human skin crafts. It's both grotesque and sad, because this isn't just about money. It's about Frank trying to take back some control, to process his grief through something, anything, that makes it feel less meaningless. But watching the lines of curious strangers outside the house tells another story. It shows just how disturbingly fascinated people are by darkness. They don't see a grieving son, they see a photo op. And that's what really stuns Sheriff Schley. He looks at the crowd and sees madness spreading. Like Ed's sickness has infected everyone else's curiosity. He's worried about Frank too, watching him spiral deeper into obsession instead of healing. So when talking doesn't work, Schley takes matters into his own hands. The night after the first day of the auction, Ed's house mysteriously burns to the ground. Every last item destroyed. Officially, it's arson, unknown suspect, but Frank knows. We know. Schley did what had to be done, to save Plainfield from turning its grief into spectacle, and to keep Frank from losing himself completely. The only thing left untouched is Ed's old pickup truck. Adeline takes charge of that, auctions it off, and sends the money to Ed in the hospital. Surprisingly, Ed is an obedient and normal patient, even teaching carpet weaving. With the money, Ed decides to buy 3 ham radios, one for himself and the other 2 to be sent to his 2 life idols. Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, who represents the part of him that is sadistic and godlike, the part that treated human bodies as raw material, and Christine Jorgensen, the first American trans woman to undergo sex reassignment surgery, who represents his yearning to be a woman, his desire to live permanently under a woman's skin to resolve his painful sexual confusion. Christine, however, explains to Ed that he doesn't truly want to be a woman. His mother's chastisement and shame surrounding normal sexual enjoyment are so deeply ingrained that he must find another way to be inside a woman without penetration, which is why he resorts to wearing their skin. During his hospitalization, Ed develops a seemingly real bond with one of the nurses, Salty, who sympathizes with him. His normal behavior suddenly changes with the arrival of a new, dominating warden named Roz, whose authoritative nature Ed immediately hates. Ed has trouble accepting dominating figures, a psychological scar left by Augusta's control. He starts to fantasize about killing Roz, plotting to sneak out one night and chainsaw her to pieces. Salty even helps him by giving him the keys, or at least, that's what he thinks. Because after the bloodbath plays out in his mind, he wakes up the next morning to find Roz alive and well. It never happened. It was all in his head. Same goes for his conversations with Ilse and Christine. Those long, delusional chats over the ham radio? Completely imaginary. The hospital had never even plugged his radio in. He'd been talking to himself the whole time, playing both sides of the conversation. Every voice he heard was just another fragment of his splintered mind. When the doctor finally breaks it to him, he says Ed's mind is like shattered glass, each piece its own identity. He's officially diagnosed with schizophrenia. And faced with that truth, Ed just gives up. He starts taking his pills, ready to silence the noise in his head once and for all. The finale immediately establishes Gein's horrifying influence by introducing 2 infamous criminals who idolize him. The FBI is at the Supermax prison in Salem, Oregon, to visit Jerry Brudos, the shoe fetish slayer, the man who killed women just to keep their lingerie and heels as trophies. They're hoping to get his insight into a string of new murders across Florida, women disappearing, bodies turning up mutilated. They even bring him a gift, a pair of red high heels, just to coax him into talking. But all they get is an admission of being inspired by Ed Gein, whom he considers a genius. Then the story moves to another infamous name, Richard Speck, the man who murdered 8 nursing students in Chicago. Speck openly admits he was inspired by Ed Gein too. As a kid, he'd read about the butcher of Plainfield in the papers, and it stuck. But what really fascinated him wasn't the murder, it was how Ed avoided execution by pleading insanity. Speck took notes, and when he was finally caught, he pulled the same trick, using mental illness as a shield. By the time we see him in prison, Speck's turned his cell into a nightclub. He's smuggling in drugs, growing breasts from DIY hormone treatments, and bragging that prison life is the best time of his life. He's not just unremorseful, he's thriving. He eventually writes a crucial letter to Ed Gein. Ed leads a mostly obedient life at the psychiatric hospital, but begins to lose hope, realizing his illnesses are incurable. He questions why he must be held against his will, perhaps wishing to return to Plainfield, but all he's got are letters from his serial killer groupies. And in one haunting hallucination, Ed dreams that he's rolling down a long corridor in his wheelchair, surrounded by his disciples Charles Manson, Ed Kemper, Jerry Brudos, and Richard Speck. They reach out to him like apostles, eager for his blessing. And at the end of the hall, waiting for him, is Augusta, his mother. She smiles, proud. She tells him he's made the Gein name immortal. That twisted praise means everything to him. In real life, Ed had never shown guilt or regret, so it tracks that even in his imagination, he saw himself as something bigger, a teacher, not a murderer. He even kept up with films inspired by him, reportedly more upset about Alfred Hitchcock's death than his own cancer diagnosis. The finale also weaves in a dark reveal. The killer the FBI's been chasing across Florida is Ted Bundy. In this version of events, Ed claims to have helped catch him. Apparently, Richard Speck once wrote Ed a letter thanking him for the inspiration, and inside, he enclosed another letter from a young admirer named Ted. In that note, Ted hinted at his own plans to sneak into a women's dorm and, quote, make history. Ed, hoping to earn his freedom or at least some recognition, tips off the FBI, telling them about Ted, the Volkswagen Beetle, and the upcoming murders. Days later, Ted Bundy is caught. Whether this really happened or was just another Gein hallucination, the show leaves up to us. Adeline Watkins, Ed's long-term friend and love interest, visits him. She has been diagnosed with mental illness and even presents a list of 3 people she feels the need to eliminate. The series strongly suggests that Adeline is only a projection of Ed's schizophrenic mind, created because he yearns to give their romantic relationship a satisfying ending. It is likely Ed's own fragmented psyche, not Adeline, that convinced him to engage in necrophilia. After Ed Gein's death, while asleep in his hospital bed, the story briefly shifts to around the year 2000, when his tombstone is permanently removed from the Plainfield cemetery. A group of teenagers pulling it out are spooked by hallucinations of Norman and Norma Bates, Buffalo Bill, and Leatherface, all characters inspired by Ed Gein. The final image shows the man himself standing at the cemetery, because no matter how many years pass, his ghost, literal or cultural, refuses to stay buried. And then there's the eerie mid-credits scene. Ed sits happily with his mother on the porch, sipping lemonade. Augusta states again that he could only be loved by a mother. For once, he looks content, because that's all he ever wanted, his mother's love, unchallenged and eternal. It's a chilling note to end on. Ed Gein, the man who turned horror into history, finally at peace, but only in death, and only in the arms of the woman who made him a monster.